in the middle of my run. I just realized in the middle of my run that you were going to give it.
Oh, where'd he go? That was so like we're getting in the middle of something amazing, and it's like the finger.
Hi, Kevin, are you with us? No?
I am. I pressed the wrong button.
And so you were in the middle of your run, and
I'm still in the middle of my run. So I'm here to listen to you. I loved your tantalizing abstract.
Oh, wow. Yes, I'm really excited about this. It's actually something I've been stewing about on ever since I was an early graduate student. This particular reading just dawned on me as the right reading, and I kind of always just played with it in my classes. But every time I would go to try to write about it, I just couldn't for some strange reason. It was just so frustrating and difficult, and it just never seemed to give, I never could get that scholarly structure to it that would make it a kind of convincing argument beyond just a flight of fancy or a wishful opinion, as Socrates says himself in the beginning of Republic, Book 5. And somehow, the pieces all started to fall into place. I think about mid fall, and so this is actually what I'm going to be presenting to you is actually the second part of a paper I just finished. That is the paper I just finished. I posted on Academia, which is still needs to be edited and proofread and all the things. But in that particular paper, I basically lay out a lot of the research I've done on the unwritten doctrines in Aristotle and other commentators. But instead of focusing on the work of the principle of the one, I've taken the research and focused on the work or the power or function of the dyad. And in that paper, I lay out about 12 different principles with regards to what the dyad provides, right? And I use that language of providing purposefully because it's in the language of the unwritten doctrines that the dyad is that principle which provides motion, space, chora, for movement, but for being in, the space for corollaries, contraries to emerge and appear, where in which I argue kind of controversy. I know that it will be polemical, that it is only within the space of the dyad that the extremes appear, like good and bad, high and low, strength and weakness, so on and so forth, but not to the point where the weak, the low, or anything on the lower half of the corollary relation is absent or devoid of the good, the strong, the high, so on and so forth, because within the dyad, there always exists yet another dyadic relationship, so that even in the lowest of terms, there's always the seed or trace of the highest or the power, so that even in the so-called bad, there is the good. And so I make the controversial claim that the dyad herself, itself, depending on how you want to play with gender with regards to those things, is the field in which the good shines or whatnot. I say all this, and you can take a look at that paper and knock me about with regards to my proof or my readings of the dyad as both a receptive but also inviting principle, insofar as she's what reaches out towards the one, and in the reaching out towards the one can grasp the limiting or equalizing aspect of the one. But these are basically my
okay.
Sorry, my kids are going outside. And then, so I lay all that out to show that at the end of the day, Plato played with gender, sex, and sexuality with regards to all of these things. Even Aristotle testifies to it and doesn't necessarily accept some of the conclusions because, you know, there's that famous quote where he's like, it would mean that there is one, male and many receptacles or many females, but really in nature it's the other way around. So we know that this proof is wrong, and so the unwritten doctrines are wrong on their face, things like this, right? And I think Plato was explicitly playing with gender because he wanted to push back against the kind of Pythagorean binary understanding of the the limit and the unlimited, to show that the one and the indefinite dyad, right, is very different because it's only in the dyad that we get the actual binary type relation. So that in the dyad, we get both male and female, masculine and feminine, and not, it's not that the one is masculine or male and the dyad is female, but rather the dyad is kind of both and in that other paper, I use the Timaeus and the Symposium to show,
Mhm. Okay.
She's returning.
Froze up and then we lost her.
sorry about that, guys. Sometime living out here on my 20-acre wood, my internet decides to be a bit of a wandering cause. So in any case, I believe that it is in the dyad that we get this corollary relationship between male and female, or masculine and feminine, and that Plato explicitly plays with this in the Timaeus, in the Symposium, so as to argue, for the necessity of the both and. In the Timaeus, we get, I argue, the dyad of the masculine demiurge and the feminine cora receptacle, who are trying to grasp both of them together with their very different powers and functions. What appears to be the limiting principle, i.e. the intelligible living being that the demiurge is compelled by necessity to look at, and the receptacle is compelled by its power to not only receive, but to invite in the principles that are also mixed by the demiurge, mixtures of being, sameness, and difference, but also when it comes to the body, middle terms that are in such a relationship that they can, no one of them overtakes the other. I also argue that the Atlantean, Athenian image at the beginning, presented by Critias, is another good example of showing how the strong, what appears strong, is not necessarily strong, whereas what is weak, i.e. the Athenians, or what looks weak, actually is the site of virtue and strength, and the ability to contain a trace in it, in the land, that it survives generations of reproduction all the way up into the current Athenians who are present for the conversation. And then the same with the Symposium. We've got the dyad of poverty and plenty, and it is in their mixture where in which we get the erotic. Again, poverty appears to have a kind of power. She's actually the one who devises a plan and is the one that is crafty. And it's in that so-called weak power that we get the reproduction of, Eros. Also keep in mind, plenty also seems kind of impoverished. He's so plentiful that he's drunk and asleep like a beggar, so on and so forth. And, I invite you guys to take a look at that paper, but the language that I'm about to start utilizing with regards to reproduction, caring for or tending to or nourishing the ideas that we see in the Symposium, or the cosmos that we see in the Timaeus are all reproduced in Book 5 of the Republic, and in interesting and fun ways that allow us to read the Republic as explicitly, when it's calling for the equality of men and women, as ruling principles to be read as the equality of those dyadic extremes, right? Where in which we have masculine as the superior principle and the feminine as the inferior principle. Ergo, why it is that it's not, to the chagrin of most feminists, it's always like, oh, he argues for the equality, but he keeps mentioning how weak they are, almost to the point of absurdity. It's 5 times, and then he also emphasizes the inferiority. And I believe that this is because it's necessary to remind us that we're talking about a corollary extreme. And so that's so much so that we see that they have the same function, but they differ in degree of power, right? But that weakness does not exclude them from ruling, right? And so they still have the power of ruling, regardless of being the weak end of that corollary extreme. And interestingly enough, like here, and so this is also explains why the strange kind of ad hoc, like the one objection that us patriarchs are going to make is that they're going to get naked in the gym, right? Like this seems like a really odd, wackadoo objection for a bunch of people who are sexist and living in a patriarchal society. Like they probably would make more interesting objections than naked gym wrestling. And so here we're invited to see how women, i.e. the weak, need to be exercised. They need to work alongside, i.e. the strong. And so here, this exercise and the language of weakness is reproduced in Socrates himself all the time when he bears his ignorance, he strips it down, he shows it, he admits all of his fears, even says he's fragile, and in other dialogues emphasizing one's weakness, that like in the Timaeus, where the opening line is the one who's absent is sick, it's actually one who's absent is weak, and he needs to be filled, or Critias and Timaeus need to fill up that weakness. And so here, Socrates constantly uses this language of admitting fears that before the arguments of the equality of women are going to produce a vast swarm, a multiplicity that causes perplexity and doubt, and the importance that we need to not hide those things, i.e. cover them up, but to strip them naked, show them so that they can be exercised in just the same way that women, i.e. the weak, should exercise alongside the strong. And what you might be thinking, what is the strong in this corollary relation? Think of Socrates, who in Republic Book 1 knows that the just life is happier than, or is confident, to use language correctly, is confident that the just life is better than the unjust life, while he's unsure of how that is so, right? So admitting these two things go along together, that we have strong ideas that we're pretty, fixed in, and they need to be exercised though, along with the many vast competing swarm of confusing, perplexing ways in which we can show how this is so, because that's what Republic 5 is all about, is the possibility and the desirability of these things versus just fixing their form. So I argue Republic 1 is a prelude, 2 through 4 is the masculine drama, i.e. the drama wherein which we're invited to get the image, or a kind of form of what the city would look like. And then Republics 5, 6, and 7 are about the power or function, i.e. the possibility and desirability, the motivating aspects of the Republic, how this is so, where in which 8, 9, and 10 are the mixture of the masculine and the feminine throughout. It explains why Book 10 is broken up with regards to both the demiurgic aspect, or the masculine aspect of form and what is form. And then the second half of the Book 10 of the Republic is what comes of the feminine, all of that, and the necessity, the eschatological myths that are very feminine and wrapped up in the feminine deities. So that 8 through 10 are the mixture of demiurge and Cora respectively. So just like the Timaeus, which is set up in the prelude, demiurge, then the works of necessity, and then their mixture. The Republic does have that same frame. I would argue the Philebus is like this as well. Okay, so that's all a prelude to what I'm doing with you guys. So let's say you have already come to accept the idea that the first wave of paradox, the equality of men and women, or the holding in common of the co-equal principles of limit and unlimited that exist within the dyad herself, that I've argued persuasively that is so. So now I've got an outline to talk about how we can understand the second wave of paradox. And interestingly, so breaking apart the second wave of paradox helps us to understand why, of necessity, the third wave of paradox is that philosophers must rule. So I would argue that if you read it without this analogy, the philosophers must rule seems to come out of nowhere after talking about the principles of war and how we ought to behave in war. Like, why should philosophers rule to make possible all of this? But once we understand it as what it is that I'll be arguing, we see that the third wave of paradox follows of necessity from the second. And so let me see if I can share my screen. All right. Okay, so as you can see, it's already quite a long outline. I started it last night to help prepare for this talk with you guys. And so I'm definitely not going to read it. I'm just going to try to give as like fun cursory, because as we all Platonists know, sometimes the more fun is just hashing it out in a battle, if you will, a war between friends, so that it's a faction. You guys see me playing with it already. But in any case, yeah, so I'm going to try my best not to get too much in the details. As you'll also notice as I go through this outline, I haven't plugged in the Greek near the end as much as I have in the beginning. And so I apologize, I just ran out of time, but know that that's my next thing to do with regards to this outline at the very least. And then of course, the hashing out of the full paper. Okay, so before starting the second wave, Socrates, again, amidst perplexity, his weakness, his confusion, that he's lazy. And so again, there's some sort of virtue in that very activity of admitting one's ignorance. There's a kind of power in a recognized weakness, but he asks for support. And this is going to be important, this language of support, because it will mirror, again, what comrades in arms need to do on the battlefield. They need to support one another. And of course, as we all know, Glaucon says he's ready to do that. He's ready to offer it. And so, yeah. And so the first premise is, if male and female share everything, including all nourishment. So again, that language of nourishment that we saw in, or we see in Diodomous' speech in the symposium with regard to nourishing our offspring in begetting the beautiful in the beautiful language, that reminds us of the spatial aspect of the dyad. And I would say this interior space of the mind, that we need to beget the beautiful in the beautiful. This nourishment that if the male and the female are nourished together and work out together, if our strong ideas and our weak ideas are nourished and work out together, then they will of necessity be attracted to one another. And Glaucon calls this an erotic necessity, as opposed to a geometrical necessity, a very odd thing to say if he's not really in on what's going on, but we'll talk about whether or not the boys are in on it near the end. He also stipulates that the practice of marriage and rearing of children should not be indiscriminate, but sacred. So again, I would argue that this is, again, emphasizing the importance of being careful with regards to how it is we practice dialectic, but we're not there yet. Noble reproduction only comes from the best of our weak and strong. So here, it's not just the best of our strong ideas or our men, but also the best of our women, i.e. our perplexities, our confusions, our mininess. And that this needs to come from those who are in their prime, which again, as Republic Book 5 seems to be obsessed with. It's got tons of corollary relationships. It's as if Socrates is trying as hard as possible to have all of these corollary relations exist in book 5 so that we see that we're thinking about the space of the dyad that runs between two extremes, excess and deficiency. And what we need is that middle term. And it's a strange middle term, right? It's an erotic middle term, an erotic quality we see in the symposium that runs the gamut of the excess and the deficiency. So it's not like 2 that sits perfectly between the 3 and the 1, but erotic necessity or the erotic measure is one that is able to partake and fill in the gap. So the language of filling in the gap from the Timaeus is also in, are you guys there? Okay, I'm gonna try again. A funny feeling that will be the last time, I hope.
This is wonderful. You know that, you remember that book of Derrida, literally on the Cora, which is full of holes, you know?
Yes.
Right.
Oh, I've lost my paper. Where'd it go? Queer, okay, that's not it. Hold on. Oh no, I've lost it. Ah, there she is. Okay. Okay. So yeah, those are in their prime, which is that middle term. But it's I really want to emphasize, as we're going to see, or if you read the other paper that still needs work on, this erotic middle it supplements, to use that language. I'm forgetting right now. I'm forgetting the exact Greek, so I don't want to mess it up, but I can look it up for you guys later. It supplements, as the word in diatomous speech says, and in the Timaeus, where in which it runs the extreme, right? So that it is both low and high, weak and strong. It touches or invites in both, so that what we are is the kind of being that must show the good even in the lowest term, and also show the bad in the highest term if it's separate from its connecting aspect. All right. And so if we get the individuals who have done well in war and we reward them with sex, these men are gonna produce as many children as possible. And I wanna put a star there where the language of the men being the cause for this production of a lot of more children is there. But then there's also that stipulation for medicine, deception and lies, to make sure that the best marry the best. And here, I think this is a self-referential moment where Socrates is, covering up his speech about the one in the dyad, or the dyad herself, with this highly elaborate, oh no, you guys there? You guys are still there? Okay, good. This highly elaborate analogy, and that this is good for the sake of not producing faction in the city, internal faction. I think it's also one of those things where we emphasize again that like in Plato's 7th letter, people can, if you just tell them about the one in the dyad, they'll just think they know it, they'll get it, and not really understand or work through it. But that's, again, speculative. Long and the short of it is, here's the best quote, okay, for this particular paper, number 6. Doesn't this, so we're going to have a lot of children, right? So doesn't this entail that the always becoming offspring, so this kind of surplus of always being produced and the always becoming, will be taken over or received by archae who attend to this, either men or women both? For the archae, both women and men are held in common. So here's like almost this language, and he's just talking about the leading principles, but he's it's almost as if he's decided, okay, I'm going to be a little less subtle. He doesn't use guardians, he doesn't use the lawmakers, he doesn't use auxiliaries, but he uses that language of archi insofar as both of those principles are going to receive the children that are produced and tend to them and care for them. The children of the good, I think, are taken to a sacred enclosure. This language of enclosure, again, is language of the dyad. As being space born along to those living in a separate part of the city. The children of the bad and the other that has become defective, they will conceal them in a secret and unseen place as appropriate. The language here is you also can't destroy your bad ideas. Like you have to just kind of hold on to them somewhere else. So, I do have a bad idea that, everything should be for me, but I don't tend to that one. I kind of put that in a secret and unseen place. That's what I would argue. And then won't these people take care of their nourishment? Again, that language of trophes, and taking the mother to the sacred enclosure. Oh, and this is what I love. I love this. They take the mothers to the sacred enclosure, wherever their breasts were swelling, right? They're overly full. And these archi have to devise mechanisms so that no particular mother perceives her own or provides, and also these archi provide other milk just in case some of the mothers aren't sufficient, and they will take care that they suckle for a reasonable measure. Again, I don't know if you remember, but at the beginning of book 5, all the men accept talking about all of this, despite the fact that it might lead the speech to take a long time. And Glaucon says the reasonable measure for talking about such doubtful things is the whole of one's life. So a kind of excess that is good. And here, this reasonable measure for suckling, may be the same, where, thinking of the doubtful or working on doubtful ideas is what nourishes us. And it's something that we should do the whole of our lives. But then again, these mothers hand over sleepless nights to other wet nurses and attendants. I love this because we kind of get this allusion to necessity, or Cora, who is also described as a wet nurse in the Timaeus. And what is it that Timaeus is doing? He is tending to a perplexity of Socrates by providing his own speech, because Socrates is no cosmologist. He can't do it. So Socrates doesn't have to spend sleepless nights working on the cosmology of the one and the indefinite dyad. And so there's this kind of fun image of the nourishment and the surplus nourishment that the perplexing or the confused or the weak can provide with regards to growth. It's what we must always, and that we can also hand over our children to others in their perplexity. I like that idea. But in any case, the children must be of parents who are in their prime. Again, the measure a reasonable period, and then he talks about various different things, so that things won't be born in darkness or cratic. And then all these fun rules for sex and who can have sex, and we can put a pin on that, but I do have explanations for each one of those, stuff that helps us understand why Socrates describes himself as barren in the Theaetetus, but also why it is that we have to be aware of the ideas that we're producing, so that we can actually tend to them and care for them. If we produce ideas we weren't really aware of. But again, I don't have to go into the details of that right now, because I want to get to the fun stuff in just a second. But oh yeah, the whole not bringing a single fetus. Oh, hey baby, I love you. Okay. To light, if it's not produced in this way, actually foreshadows something that Socrates will say later when it comes to if they can't solve the third wave of paradox, then we shouldn't bring this Callipolis will never come to light because we won't have the means to care for it. And so it's really interesting parallel language that's happening there. And then again, as we all know, everything for this city to be, or the main stipulation of the city is that everybody will feel related, and yeah, we can talk about the details of that if you want once we get into it. Okay, for now, the heart of this particular paper is really about showing why this is best, why it's best that the male and female ruling principles produce good children in a careful manner, or why it is that when we practice philosophy, we have to marry the one and the many, or the strong and the weak, the high and the low, the same and the different, in such a way that we carefully produce children, why this is best. Well, he makes that distinction between the best and the worst state, where in which the best will not be divisive, and it will experience, I love this, this is like proof in the pudding, you know, experience extreme pain and joy in a unified way throughout the city, versus the worst will experience extreme pain and joy, but only in parts, and will be divided and acratic, and in that, you know, the good city that's bound and unified will experience things as a single person, like an organism. So thinking of the phaedrus, where everything is connected and bound together, so that so much so that the Kallipolis, as we see, we'll think of its rulers as saviors and protectors in battle. So that language of protecting again, and the rulers will think of the citizen body not as slaves. So, you know, the mind, the reason won't think of our spirit and our desires coming from bodily appetites as slaves to reason, but as employers and providers. And I like the language of employers because it does give this idea that the body will experience recompense, right? That the body will be something that earns and provides, again, are part of the whole process, versus something separate. It's also just described later as an attendant as well. Okay, then there's some more rules. So there'll be no lawsuits or trials. Oh, I like this one too. Disputes in the unified city will be solved by a good old-fashioned fight, i.e. we'll have good old-fashioned arguments, right? That exercise out our disputes, instead of it being violent or assaults on other people. The language of so the older ideas, or, you know, persons rule over the younger. Language of fear and shame is really important, but I won't get into that here either. The petty points, that the poor, i.e. the parts of ourselves, won't flatter the rich, and the lesser or the poor won't need to steal or borrow. They won't even need to default on payment and sell wives. Here, this is a really lovely image, if we take the analogy as apt, where in which there aren't parts of ourselves that are so destitute, i.e. if I rule with both the many and the one, sameness and difference, I won't treat my body in such a way that certain desires would feel that they just need to steal and take and overtake and be violent, that we will be able to tend to them, so that there's no part of ourselves that's desperate or needing of something else besides the harmony of our soul. All parts of the soul will be provided for, all will be happy, not just the rulers. Okay, so what makes this possible harmonious soul city at all, right? Well, it's so strange. Everybody's like, why the F would he go to the conditions for war, right? So, and good practices in war. Well, if he's talking about a practice of dialectic that allows for us to marry the limit and the unlimited in such a way that we can produce the happy individual or person who experiences a range of corollary emotions, whether it be joy or depression, but in all parts of ourselves. That's where the equality is. It's not that we get rid of these extremes of emotion in the soul, but that dialectic makes possible for us to experience those things in a unified way, so that we're never they're never destructive of the city or never destructive of our core being as beings that must run the gamut of those extreme aspects of being human. So they all march out together. Again, it takes the children who are in their prime, and the like children, and they're even compared to children of demiurges who must watch and look and attend and serve their fatherly figures, and in so doing, they gain experience to engage in the craft of war. And so here, if I'm right, war here is observing arguments and observing philosophical battles, and he's going to change those battles into factions in a few minutes so that they're friendly rather than destructive of the other. There's also language that mirrors dichotomous speech, wherein which every animal fights better when its offspring are present, so that parents will fight better. So our ideas, our young ideas will learn, our young ideas motivate our more established ideas to work harder. And then there's Glaucon's idea of the risk that it takes. Again, that language of risk reproduces Socrates' language of risk at the beginning, his fears of advancing what could happen, that people would fight out his, or fight against his ideas with regards to the Callipolis. But we must devise a way to keep our ideas safe. And today we need to know which arguments are dangerous, which ones are not. We need to also give them competent and experienced leaders or ruling principles so that they be guided, led and guided by them. And if in the unexpected moment our ideas are in danger of being completely quashed, we need to provide them with wings so that they could fly and escape. Horses, not fiery war horses, but the fastest and most obedient. So we get kind of an image of the soul and the Phaedrus, two different types of horses. We need to make sure that we have a way of escape in our arguments that allows us to safely make our way through any risk. And then he discusses the behavior of troops towards themselves and enemies. With themselves, anybody who is cowardly amongst the troops should be demoted, i.e. isn't willing to run the risk in an argument. If captured, i.e. if somebody else wins the argument, we can let that person have our idea and they can use it in any way they want. And then good ideas that win have to shake hands and exchange kisses, show their love, compliment. This is how we encourage the ideas to reproduce, is to say when people have done well or not. We honor them with songs, i.e. just like Socrates puts forward a good image of the Callipolis, somebody like Timaeus and Critias offer songs or their own images to encourage the greatness of those arguments or ideas that die are destroyed in battle. We will honor them like daemons. So again, maybe Plato eventually felt like the unity of virtue maybe needed to be overturned, but we're still going to honor that argument like a daemon and defend it and emphasize it. And they're described as guardians of articulate men. Why would they be guardians of articulate men if they were really, this was really about war and battle, but versus articulation and argumentation? Again, he emphasizes that these men are daemons, and so we must consult how to bury them, whether those who die in battle or old age, no matter what, they need to be honored and worshiped. And then behavior towards enemy, no enslavement. So here, we're not going to make a person we've refuted be a slave to our ideas. We can't despoil the dead or strip their corpses bare, i.e. bring them to complete ignorance so that they can no longer, so that if we're not going to, this is, I think, the argument here where in which we need to recognize that we can't destroy people entirely and completely strip them down to their bodies. That is described as a kind of inferior, small, womanly mentality. And so I would argue the way that Thrasymachus argues that Socrates is a silly wet nurse or whatnot, like is an argument ad hominem where we're just directing our argument to the person and not the ideas. And so I think this is an argument that we ought not treat our enemies or our combatants in dialectical argumentation in ways that don't reflect the argument between ideas rather than persons. We shouldn't take from other people's arguments as far as don't take the spoils and bring them to the gods. We risk pollution. No, and then the language of land and motherhood comes back up. No ravaging the Greek land or burning, but so we shouldn't ravage the other to the point where they become misologists. They no longer want to ever argue, or they don't see the point in argument. We can take a year's harvest, is what's said, right? So we can take a little bit of their perplexity, their ignorance for ourselves, right? So like, don't burn them down, but take a little bit of their nourishing food again to nourish ourselves. And then there's all the distinctions between war and faction that ultimately show that we should be having civil disputes with others, both with Greeks and non-Greeks, both people like ourselves, people also unlike ourselves, people who don't have these rules. So we should treat Glaucon and Adamantus and Polemarchus the same way that we would treat a Thrasymachus, in such a way that if we have an argument, ultimately we hope it'll be corrective, is basically that what we want is to correct our enemies rather than to ravage them, and that we treat them kindly in the hopes that in the future that we will be able to reconcile. And so here, Thrasymachus is a good example of somebody Socrates treated kindly, and now Thrasymachus is calm, right? And listening and not contentious, no longer like a dog. The language of dogs is in there as well. And so, yeah, that is what good dialectic should look like with regards to both our treating our friends, but also treating our so-called enemies who are not really our enemies. Again, hearkening to Book 1 of the Republic. And then, of course, I say, Glaucon stops Socrates midway through all this list of how to treat people in battle and says, but wait, what makes all this possible? You still haven't described what makes this city possible. And Socrates basically says, well, that's going to lead to this bigger wave. And that bigger wave is the wave that politicians should be mixed together. Can't have one extreme or the other. They have to be a mixture of the two. And then there's all the stipulations that this is, again, a paradigm, not necessarily something possible in real life, but we're putting it forward so as to see the most beautiful or the good. And then I could go into all the details of how the third wave of paradox in Book 5 reinforces all that language of making distinctions of that this is going to be a big battle. Glaucon uses the language that somebody who disagrees with this third wave would be like somebody ready to grab a spear and fight and is enraged, right? So the kind of enemy that doesn't yet see that it's a faction rather than a war. Again, the language of if they can't save the city with this third wave of paradox, then they need to escape, much like the children on horses need to escape. And so that we need a new, more stable argument. Number 3, the third wave of paradox. All of that's there. And I'd love to talk to you about it in detail, but I feel just like Socrates that I've gone on too long. But the point is as you can see, even though I don't have the Greek plugged in, if you are skimming this at all, you can see that the language of necessity and the dyad is all saturating the corollary extreme between knowing and not knowing, sight lovers and actual lovers of knowledge, or the philosopher, where in which the lover of knowledge is able to unite the extremes between knowing and not knowing, whereas the lover of opinion also sits at the middle in between an opinion, but wanders around versus being able to direct themselves towards knowing. And so that's what the philosopher would look like, as somebody who has the principles of at both extremes married so as to be able to direct the soul in harmony. And that's where I'll just kind of lead off and be ready to battle with you guys. Is it a Wendig?
It's a lot to digest for me. At least.
So, Danny, you are
And
kind of
me-
doing an allegorical reading of this section, an amazing allegorical reading of it. Is that an accurate description of what you are doing? And
Yeah.
it's totally, I mean, it's really makes these passages a lot of sense, because they are the most enigmatic sections of Plato, to me at least.
No, me too. I mean, I've always, I can't tell you how many times I've read book 5 with such a disappointment, and like, none of this seems very Platonic. This whole idea of breeding the best to produce the best is so counter to the Meno, where, good men can't produce good children. So something is off here. I don't know what's going on, but I've spent 2 days really trying to figure this particular book out. But then when you read it alongside the Timaeus and the Symposium, where the gendered language of reproduction is also prevalent, in the language of nourishment, attending to and caring for your offspring, it just, I mean, I've always, like I said, I've always had this intuition that that's how you should read this, but I didn't do the work of putting all the language together, where this language is mirrored in all 3 texts. There's not a lot of wiggle room, but of course, it could just be a coincidence that he uses the same language. But I don't think Plato is one for, being too coincidental. As far as it being an image too, I mean, I just like to remind you that even though it was a different time that he had that speech with Timaeus and Critias, advancing the Callipolis, the Timaeus opens with a rehashing of this marriage, this holding in common of men and women, and the careful reproduction of ideas. And Timaeus and Critias have been charged with the task of now putting that city in motion and in war, right? So just like here in book 5, where motion, i.e. the growth of the ideas, the carrying to or rearing to these ideas, and what it looks like in war, they've been tasked to do that. And they don't provide more politics, right? Or more images of the Callipolis. What they do is they both provide their own image, whether it be the Atlantean myth or the cosmology. And then also, if you take that into account with Republic Book 6, when Socrates says that if he's going to talk about who the real philosophers are, he's going to have to provide another icon. And Polemarchus laughs and says, "Oh, you're not one for making icons." And Socrates says, "Oh, you're mocking me." And so it's almost as if everybody is in on it, right? So it's not the Leo Straussian, we have to be secretive, but no, rather the best way to talk about the dyad is through these images, right? Where we run fields of corollaries. And so that all people in Socrates' circle, they know that to respond with Socrates' own image of the dyad, they have to produce their own that are completely separate and other, and not all completely like, but a little bit different. As Dionysus says, when we replace new offspring, they're going to be otherwise, but they're going to be like the original. And so that this might have been what the feast of ideas always was, between the company of philosophers or people in the circle. Is, all right, here, your day for an image of the dyad, your day for an image of a dyad, and so that the whole group is kind of in on it. And so that's one of the reasons why Glaucon stops them and says, "Okay, good. I got the list for all the behavior and dialectic. We already do that. Don't you see, we've all agreed to hold this in common." So they all agreed at the very beginning of book 5 that this would be the conversation, and that we'd all support each other and not be hostile with each other. Okay. Tell us what makes that possible. What makes that something meaningful and good? Well, philosophy makes dialectic possible, but a particular kind of philosophy, the kind of philosophy that's geared towards the good rather than towards heuristics. So remember that book 5 also opens with that distinction between dialectic and heuristics. Heuristics will just do contradiction, whereas dialectic will marry the one and the many, or different kinds of differences, because that's how he's able to sort out why women have the same power, is because he examines as a dialectic of difference, as opposed to doing heuristics, which would just point out their difference as a contradiction. Kevin?
Yes, just a couple of questions here, but thank you very, very much. It's so lovely to see you completely inside the text, understanding it, as it were, from inside itself, as if you've somehow allowed the soul and the body of the text actually to pervade each other, so that one can't tell the difference between the soul and the body in a certain kind of way at a certain point. And I mean that in a kind of meaningful way for Plato himself. And I just have a series of questions here. And how do you, first of all, drawing back the focus, how do you see overall the relation, let's say, how do you see, not even the relation, but how do you see the unwritten teachings on the one hand and the dialogues on the other? That is, how do you see, let's say, the arguments between the Tübingen school and, let's say, earlier Schleiermacher, etc. Or do you refuse to see the dichotomy, the ultimate dichotomy between these two apparently incommensurable ways of seeing Plato? Rather, you don't see that they're incommensurable. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah. So I think no, that they're the unwritten doctrines enrich, allow us to penetrate, if you will, in a kind of playful way. So I think that Plato. So I think about the Phaedrus, right? And, we'll write, and this is a kind of play. This is the playfulness, and that this play is good and it's enriching, but that there are certain things that are impossible to really put out in such a way that's clear. In fact, why? Because it's of necessity, I would argue, that as human beings who are both and being and nothingness, things are going to be unclear, and we need to write in such a way that we safeguard the importance of perplexity and confusion, not because it's just some sort of Socratic, thing, right? But because it's a fundamental part of what it means to be a philosopher is not to hide or dismiss your weakness or your perplexity, because that's part of what it means to be human. And so I guess I would say, because when I read the people of the Tübingen school, they're obsessed with the principle of the limit, right? And what work the limit is doing, and so they come to texts like the Republic, and they just focus on things like the analogy of the sun to the good, and so they cherry pick, I think, so that their particular methodology they don't actually let it enrich the whole of text, but it's as if they think, okay, Plato's he's sneaking it in now. He's sneaking it in now, versus this kind of really fundamental, like, this is a way of life, and my way of life, and thinking about all the things that can be produced when I think that the highest principles are the one in the indefinite dyad, where in which the indefinite dyad is actually the site that we work through, that we might be reaching like the dyad towards the one, and receptive of the one in that reaching process. But we ourselves are dyadic. We run that field of corollaries, and our reaching is a reaching of the both and. If you want to hear me be really speculative, here's a little crazy thought. The one, as in a contradictory relationship to the indefinite dyad, in the dyad being the principle of relation, the one is definite nothingness, right? And so this is why the field of corollaries is high and low, or weak and strong, because at the height of the dyad, when she's reaching toward the one, she grasps or receives the definiteness of the one, but also at the low, grasping or receiving the nothingness of the one. And so the field of corollaries between being and not being is this capturing of the one in its completeness.
Yeah, no, I think I really understand you, and I can see ramifications for this interpretation also in very famous passages, also much later in Plotinus, 5.2, 1 to 3, for instance, 5.2, chapter 1, lines 1 to 3, for instance, which produce the paradox of the nothingness right in the very center of everything which comes out of the one. But I wanted to ask you kind of a follow-up to that. So in a sense, what we can do, what I hear you saying in a certain way, what I hear coming through is something that I like. We can make too strong a false dichotomy, let's say, between playfulness and between paideia, and the spoudios in a certain way, so that we valorize, let's say, so that we valorize a particular scholastic tradition, let's say in the academy or something, where you seriously pursue things, whereas in the dialogues you don't seriously pursue them, as in the end of the Phaedrus, it's just paideia. Instead of understanding that in fact actually we need both of these things. And there's no reason at all why, if we want to hold to both of them as important to us as ephemeral, time-bound people, we want to understand the kind of playfulness of the seriousness of the serious, and the seriousness in the heart of the playfulness, which makes it really possible. So that, from my point of view, I'm kind of convinced by your account here. It seems to me that there's no reason why a dialogue can't be open-ended, and why the work in the academy, let's say it's going to go to Euclid's Elements much later in Egypt, but that doesn't mean to say it's not serious and open-ended and playful at exactly the same time. You can actually hold both together equally. So this kind of strange dichotomy between the unwritten writings on the one hand, and then this kind of no, we need this analytic account of Plato, doesn't account for all the things that you've been looking at. The allegorical reading that Donko picks up here, the kind of fun that's there in Plato, the angular metis, Odysseus kind of level of Plato, that the Plato is not, he's not Kevin, an Englishman, even if that Englishman is transported into a different realm. He's a Greek, right? And he's always playful and always coming at things at an angle, so that, not to use Heidegger's language, but not the early Heidegger or the late Heidegger, but rather that really, as soon as you open up something, it also has the seeds of its concealment at the same time, aletheia or whatever. Yeah, does that make sense?
No, I know it absolutely does, because one of the great things about book 5 is it's talking about that corollary between seriousness and playfulness, always showing that most people laugh at what is serious, and most people don't see how serious what is so-called laughable, i.e. the women being naked. And so again, what's happening in the Republic is showing, look in this laughable thing is something very serious. But also when we think about the 7th letter, something very serious that is happening in, like, this person thinks they have, they're laughable for thinking they understand the one and the indefinite dyad, or the unwritten doctrines. But also, like, when I first started playing with this idea, I hadn't yet really learned a lot about the unwritten doctrines, right? So when I was thinking, 10 years ago about the equality of men and women, before I really kind of nosedived into the value of the unwritten doctrine, I knew of them then, but I didn't understand them. So I wasn't really doing the work to really work through them. But even, 10 years ago, I would have said, look, this male, right? Like most of us as philosophers focus too much on sameness, limit, unity, bringing things into cohesion. And so that Plato seems to be aware that there's a real problem with rationalistic, dogmatic types of thinking. And then there's also a real problem with not philosophers, but heuristics, right? So that if we only have the feminine all by itself is too caught up in multiplicity and relativity. And so that when we marry the many and the one, and in the way that we think, right, we're able to balance dogmatism and relativism, so that we don't become a sophist nor a politician, so that we get the sophist is the philosopher, who just goes into the manyness and can't get out. And so they become a belief that there's nothing but opinions and winning, i.e. your Thrasymachus who wants to win. And then on the other spectrum, there is the assholes who put Socrates to death because they think they know what is right and true and just. And so, yeah.
Or even a rather ironic asshole, like he's not actually really, but like Eryximachus. I mean, if the symposium finished at Eryximachus, we wouldn't really have. We'd have Aristophanes' hiccups, but we wouldn't have the untamed passion and illogicality of Aristophanes, which actually leads to something so important in the symposium too. And in book 5, particularly the question, book 5, and then book 6 of the Republic, the question of the impossibility of the possible and the possibility of the impossible, which actually is emphasized throughout and brings out the question that, of course, we pretend that we can do this all on our own, but in fact, actually, we're thrown into the world. Sorry to keep thinking of Heidegger here, but we're thrown into the world, and we have to find our way of dealing with it, rather like with Marcus Aurelius, book 1 of the Meditations, everything we have has been given to us. I mean, like Marcus Aurelius finishing that first book of the Meditations there, and thanks to the gods too who've given us everything, which of course is part of what we have to bring together in those books of the Republic. I just wanted to ask you one of the questions.
As many as you want. I love the mininess. A swarm of bees.
I wanted to ask you just this one question here, because you did say something that I found fascinating. You said, pushing back against the Pythagorean table of opposites. In the dyad, the corollary relation between male and female, it's a question of both and. And I find that so interesting. And then you mentioned the Philebus. And I just wondered if you could comment upon that, because the Philebus bring limit and unlimited together in the mixture. I just wonder if you could just, because I thought that I agree with you about pushing back against a rigid notion of the Pythagorean table of opposites. Look at the use of phaulos and spudaios right throughout the symposium, and also in the Republic throughout, and the subordinating of these things. Exiphanes at the top of the ladder of Exiphanes at the top of the ladder of ascent, and Exiphanes the drunken Aristophanes. Okay, so we get the most airy-fairy immaterial, and at the same time we get the most material and the most destructive at the same time, and somehow we have to deal exactly with both. And that's when, of course, and at that particular point, the flute player, the flute player is actually physically going to come back into the room and transform everything too. So I just wonder how you see this. Would you have a story about this? This is a big question to ask. It's just, and I don't know if you can answer it. Don't feel you really have to. How do you see this in relation, let's say, to the Philebus?
No, so the Philebus is, so all my research for the Philebus and how this maps on, I did back before Christmas started. So it's not fresh on my mind, but I do know that all the language that I have been working with regards to the Timaeus, the Symposium, Republic Book 5, 6, and 7, because remember, 5, 6, and 7, which I believe is the female drama, or the drama of the dyad, is all there in the Philebus as well. I mean, but you basically already answered your own question, because you talk about the importance of the mixed life, and that's what happens in the Philebus is it's neither one nor the other. It's neither the limit or the unlimited, but it is in their mixture that we get a kind of life in which we feel pleasure, right? That the intellectual life has to be it's married to this kind of pleasure that we get when we're talking. And I don't think there's he's talking to the very young, right? And he himself, and so there's all sorts of mixtures happening in the very way of the conversation. But to just pause, like that for me, along with the Sophist, those two texts, they really reinforce the importance of the relationship that is already the already married, so I love the Philebus, and I'm just kind of throwing my cards out here, because in that particular text, he emphasizes we have the limit and the unlimited, we have the mixture, but we also have the mixer, right? And like here, the parallels to the Timaeus are just like, what is this mixer, right? And I would argue the mixer, is, it's of course the demiurge, but many people have said this, but
it's the urgic. Let us make the mixture, right?
And that's what we're supposed to model this mixer, right? To be the mixture, and so that there's still this one low power, so to speak, looking to or trying to grasp this seemingly higher power, right? It's like the demiurge is not, a being qua being, like it's a power or an activity, and so that what we get between the two fields of excess and deficiency with regards to the limit and the unlimited are two middle terms, right, that explain why we can fill the gap between the limit and the unlimited via our certain power rather than our stable being, is what I would argue. We have a stable being, but our stable being is much what Proclus would say. Our stable being is the being of movement, time, flux, becoming, but we have to show the being or the power or the strength in being that kind of being.
Danny, just I'll stop right there. I must let other people talk, but thank you so much for this. It's been so good.
Oh, Kevin, please, I love talking to you.
Will you give me permission to continue my run? Or else
yes,
because I've got to go for dinner tonight.
Please.
I must finish my run, but I'm so glad I wouldn't have missed this for anything. Thank you all, and thank you, Danny, particularly.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, and thank you for everything. I really appreciate all your kind words.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Could I maybe ask a question, Danny?
Yeah, please.
So I've been thinking of this in psychological terms too, and I'm trying to remember. I'm sure the rest of you remember this. That Freud distinguished two kinds of cognition. I think it was primary process and secondary process. And thinking about the playful aspect of this, it's a common technique of creativity to try and put yourself in sort of the primary conscious mode. Defocusing attention, relaxing the body, kind of nonlinear thinking, and it seems to me that's very much associated with the indefinite dyad. You want the ideas to kind of nucleate out of a more of a uniform background, and analogies, metaphors, all of these things are part of the process that brings them to birth, and again, we nurture them. And then we go into what I think is the secondary process, where it's more rational and heuristic, as you said, and logical and so forth, more systematic exploration of the ideas. And so I wonder if these two kind of primary modes of cognition that we've got also correspond to the monad and the indefinite dyad, especially.
No, I would absolutely agree. And we have to marry both of them. We can't, depend on one or the other so in Aristotle's Metaphysics, I forget exactly which line. I want to say, I don't know. I can look it up for you because I have it all listed. He argues that for the Platonists, the unwritten doctrines, that the dyad is the source of opining, knowing, intellection, and dialectic, right? Sorry, dialectic should have been before intellection. But the point is that the dyad is the inner, the reason why the dyad is responsible for those activities is those are the activities of allowing us to run, to reach after the one, right? All four of them, and all four of them are important and powerful in various different ways, because they, when directed towards the limiting principle or the one, actually can move towards the object for which they are trying to see in the case of opining, or know in the case of dialectic, so on and so forth. But the point is that's our power to move. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, even in this primary or limited form of, even when I am doing the kind of work that is typical of a philosopher, i.e. the kind of more rigid, rational ways of thinking, i.e. dialectic, I still like the dyad is still the power, the movement that allows for those activities for the human being. So that in some sense, yes, we have a methodology based upon, creating images that are perplexing and confusing, and that we have to admit that before, and keep in mind, every time he talks about anything dyadic, so book 5, he invokes the goddess, the Moira and the Fates, and then the book closes with Themis, and then of course the Timaeus, Ananke, and then the Symposium. It is Eleutheia and Moria, who are, there, that preside over the birth of the beautiful, so that, all of these images are of necessity also the methodology for thinking of the dyad. But even the more typical activities of opining, knowing, and intellection are also only possible with this field of corollaries that the dyad provides.
So is that part of the difference between the definite dyad and the indefinite dyad too? I mean, a definite dyad is more a definite relational thing between monads, whereas the indefinite dyad is more the potentiality for differing monads.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, because we in the unwritten doctrines, right, there's a real sense, and if we think of the dialogues as providing us more information about how to think of the dyad, we kind of get this idea that the one and the indefinite dyad in themselves don't exist, right? That all we have is in fact the dyad that has reached out and grasped the one, or touches. I like the better language of touch better. And in that touch explodes open into a field of definite things that are mirroring the one in its determination and its nothingness, so that we also mirror the indefinite dyad in both levels, being and becoming, in a kind of perplexity or indefiniteness. So this is a weird indeterminate determination space that all of being and becoming exist in. And so, yes, this weird determinate dyad, but also this indeterminate reality or being that we exist in. So, yeah.
It is interesting, that passage in the Philebus where he's describing dialectic, because the last line, he's here it is. He says, we perceive that the one which he began with is one and many and infinite, but discovers how many it contains. For that a man should never proceed to the idea of the infinite and apply it immediately to any number before he has fully discovered all the definite numbers which lie between the infinite and the one, but that having completed this discovery, we should then finish our search and dismiss into infinity every one of all those numbers, and should bid farewell to them. It's like, that's the final power. You may have got you may have got it all worked out. You may have got the scheme, but in the end, that scheme is going to get in the way of stuff, of whatever you want to call it, reality.
No, absolutely. It's one of the reasons why. So if you look at the argument I didn't go into very closely, where it says the old ought not reproduce after they've hit their prime. And I remember, sitting on this for a while, and I don't know why it took me so long, but the Theaetetus and Socrates' method of refutation and the Elenkos and bringing that back, where in which the old should tend to and help, but not necessarily reproduce. Like, that's that basic idea that if we don't have time to care for our ideas ourselves, yes, we can give birth to them, but we need to also disperse them, because we need to have the ability to stew and sit and care for our ideas. And so I think Socrates' admittance to being barren in the Theaetetus is about, I am now at the point in my life, right, where I might reproduce, but I should expose it if I do. I disperse it into a million different multiplicities, and so practice, the Elenchos, or the method of refutation, on even all my ideas, and or act as a midwife who allows others to give birth to the beautiful and the beautiful. Because they're young enough and of the prime age, or prime aspect of their life, that their ideas can be nurtured by the particular person, so that they'll have a lifetime of being ruled by the basic principles. So Theaetetus, I think the reason why it starts off with Theaetetus's death and all these wonderful things about him is because we all know that he was exposed, had this conversation with Socrates, was able to give birth to his own ideas, which Socrates reinforces, his own ideas about sense perception and what knowledge is, that ultimately, ground him as, one of the best geometers in the world. And so.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
What I admire about what you've done here is I've got the paper that's the Queer Arche paper, which I think a lot of what you've just been talking about comes from that. If I'm not, yeah.
The first 8 minutes of my chat was trying to kind of give a summary version of that paper. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I haven't fully sunk my way into it and absorbed it and read it carefully enough. But what I admire is you're taking on this idea of finding the impossibility of thinking of the one and the indefinite dyad as if they independently exist. They don't. That there's only some kind of mixture of the two that we have any discussion about whatsoever. So in a way, when we talk about either one of them, it's a kind of useful fiction for us, or theoretical kind of pretense of some kind. And then you're talking about that the demiurge is not a being, but an activity, which is the way these two principles that are in tension kind of are mixed together. These opposites are mixed together through this activity. That activity is the demiurge. And I think that when Kevin said we can be invited into it in a theurgic way, that if we can enter into that activity, then we are doing that very thing. But what I love about what you're doing is finding all those hints in Plato that he's sort of giving us little glimpses of how to appreciate this. And that's where it's incredibly complex for me. And it takes a deep reading of the passages that you go through. Those first 8 minutes are pretty dense. To sum up this paper, and I really appreciate what you've done with it. It's a lot there, and I'm going to be sitting on it and trying to find my own clues to work with it from.
Greg, I need to finish editing and proofreading so that paper reads a little bit more strongly, I guess. And so if you find yourself like, I don't understand what this paragraph means, please don't hate me. I promise I'm still working on it to make it stronger and clearer. I remember after like 24 hours after I uploaded, I was just so happy that I finally fleshed it out. But then 24 hours later, I was like, I am so embarrassed. It's not ready to be seen. I've given birth to a premature baby. But so I will probably be uploading a fresher or cleaner version of it in the next few days. So don't worry. That will be coming. So.
But I just look forward to digging through it. And there may be places where I would even want to write you and say, do you mean this here, or do you mean that there? And then that might be related to what you're talking about in terms of revising it or not. But I really appreciate your diving into this. Is one of the most complicated of things. And Tim's comment about the Philebus quotation, we don't go immediately from the one to the infinite, but we have to go through all the numbers. But then the last part of what you read, Tim, is that we go to all the numbers and then we let it go, or something to that effect. That's the kicker, you know, and that's the sort of, where do we let it go? Because we're living it. We are it. We're not still, I mean, it depends on how you interpret that last piece. What does letting it go mean? And I find that to be an intriguing passage too.
And I think you get an echo of it in the Symposium, where Diotima takes him so far and says, you follow this so far, but now the doubt, right? And that doubt is the thing that allows Socrates into it. That's what allows the goldenness, if you like, to actually appear, which obviously Alcibiades points out has happened. I constantly say to people, in the initiation every initiation always comes with the possibility of failure, of doubt, because we miss that with all those formal initiations that people go through. You know, when you go up onto the stage to receive your degree, you've got it. There's no fear that they're going to say, oh no, sorry, we've made a mistake, this isn't your degree. And that's what I feel the West has lost, the idea that you can fail. Of course, we're discovering now you can fail in all kinds of ways, but for a while I think we'd forgotten it. And that moment of doubt that Diotima introduces right at the end of her teaching is, I think, the equivalent of that letting go into infinity.
So where is that? I want to make sure I understand the passage you're talking about, Tim, when she says, you know, a lot of people could have followed me up to this point, but now what I'm going to tell you is a little bit more challenging and you need to be initiated. That's the piece that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Symposium, one of the things I love about it is exactly what Tim is getting at here, where in which we have images of a bunch of different student-teacher relationships throughout the whole of the Symposium, you know, beginning with Aristodemus, the narrator, who seems, you know, to have gotten the spirit of the Elenkos to the point where he's haughty and arrogant, and believes he knows that he, in his not knowing, he's better than everybody else. And then, you know, we get Alcibiades, who seems to have had all the goodies, all the powers that would make him a great philosopher or a person. But he like plenty, you know, prefers the drunkenness and, you know, a kind of impoverished life. But then we also, of course, have Diotima and Socrates, and then Socrates and Apollodorus, where Apollodorus, he is invited by Socrates. I'll get it in a second. Okay. He's invited by Socrates to go to the house of the good, and they walk together. But eventually Socrates has to you know, stop and not go with them, and Apollodorus keeps going, right, and gets to the house of the good on his own. And you know, Alcibiades, you know, was abandoned by Socrates too, but unlike Apollodorus, didn't continue. He still got to the house of the good, but not a kind of good that is reflective of the Platonic life, as a different perverted version of it. He sees Socrates in a wholly other light than the way Apollodorus sees Socrates. But I say all of this, right, because what I mean by what I think was happening with the importance of dispersion, right, is the importance that we have to do this ourselves. Like, this is also, not only is this an activity with our colleagues and friends where we dialogue with one another, but we also have to let others people go off on their own and to give birth to ideas in their individual places, so that when they come back into a dialectical relationship with another, they are able to have their own, but also their own that they can get rid of or have refuted. I'll get it. Sorry, I'm motherly duties always.
I'm going to have to take off because I
Yeah.
have some other kind of duties, but this is great, Danny, and appreciate
I
your letting it roll here. Tim,
I-
yeah.
Yeah, Greg, thank you so much for your comments, and everybody, thank you. I mean, yeah, you have no idea how much I appreciate this group. I hope that you all know that I learn so much every time one of you guys presents, or when you let me do my crazy ideas in my random weird way. I really feel supported and encouraged to use the language of the Republic and Glaucon. So thank you.
Oh.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, Danny, and do let us once you've updated, no matter how unfinished you think it is that time round, do let us have an update, because that's yeah, it's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for all your amazing quotes. And if you could send me the link, I might make it, you know, put something I put on my academia as well, so that rando people can look at this and get an idea of where I'm going with the rest of the Republic Book 5.
Right, excellent.
Great. That's really interesting.
Thank you. That's
Thanks,
fascinating.
Brenda.
everybody.
Thanks,
Good night.
Bruce. Thanks,
Thank
Donka.
you.
Thanks, Tim.
Yep.
Bye.
See you all next time.
So long.